Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable philosophical discussions and helping you develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Russ Shafer-Landau. We speak on his work on moral realism. Moral realism is a meta-ethical position stating that there are moral facts that are independent of what people and societies think. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing. And if you're on Apple, rating and reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Russ Shafer-Landau. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today, I have with me Dr. Russ Shafer-Landau. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So before we get started on our topic today, if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
I'm a professor of philosophy, and I have been for about 30 years. I teach at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and except for a 2-year hiatus down at UNC Chapel Hill, I've been here for 20 years. I taught my first 10 years at the University of Kansas and grad school before then. And I like to think about lots of different issues in moral philosophy, and in particular that area of philosophy known as metaethics, which is thinking about the status of morality, where it comes from, if it comes from anywhere, how we can know about it, and what its rational authority over us might be.
How did you first get into philosophy? Was it something that you kind of fell into through grad school or through college, or is it something you kind of picked up earlier in your life and just kind of went with it? So yeah, if you want to talk about a little bit about your prior experience.
Yeah, it was totally a bit of luck. When I was 14, I grew up outside Philly, and I went up to the mountains of Western Massachusetts, where I worked as a prep cook in the kitchen in a hotel, and the head chef in there was a philosophy grad student. He was twice my age. He seemed ancient at that point, uh, and he sort of took me under his wing. I don't know why, what he saw in me, but he gave me, he started feeding me books, the existentialists and Nietzsche, and said, happy to talk about these with you. And so that's where I first heard the word philosophy, probably, and the first philosophy I ever read there. And it really seemed very interesting to me. So I did it. We didn't have philosophy in my high school, but I was just reading it on my own. And then when I went to college, I thought I'd be a philosophy major. And turns out I did become a philosophy major.
Yeah, very
The
cool.
rest is history.
So as you were studying, because there's so many different branches of philosophy, right? You have epistemology, you have philosophy of religion, uh, ethics, and metaphysics. So how did you, was it during college, right, where you decided which one you'd rather kind of more, which one would you rather study? Yeah, so like how did you fall into ethics in particular?
Uh, that's interesting. What happened was I thought I wanted to go to college to study philosophy to figure out the meaning of life. And I tried doing that for the first 2 years, and I didn't manage to do that. Mostly because the philosophy courses that were offered there wasn't any course called the meaning of life. And so I took an ethics course, and that seemed really dry and unrelated to what I was interested in. So then I sort of just dabbled around the curriculum and didn't take much philosophy. Then I left college for a year because I felt at sea. When I came back, I decided I wanted to go into philosophy in earnest. And I was really lucky at that point because I had two amazing, brilliant teachers. One was Roderick Chisholm, who taught metaphysics and ethics, and the other was Martha Nussbaum, who taught ethics, but at that point, primarily through the lens of ancient Greek philosophy. And so, what I really got super interested in was Greek philosophy. So when I went to grad school, I decided to pursue that. It wasn't ethics really, um, but once I got to grad school, I realized I could spend the next 6 years of my life trying to master ancient Greek and Latin and German and French, and probably not even do a very good job at that. Or I could just do philosophy. So, and I decided to do the latter because I wasn't great at languages. And where I went to grad school, they had a lot of really great people doing ethics. So I just sort of fell into ethics, actually. That's the way it happened.
All right. Well, very cool. And I think this is a good segue into kind of our topic today, which is more realism and meta ethics. And so, yeah, if you want to kind of describe what meta ethics is and kind of what's the primary, I guess, study behind, yeah, meta ethics.
Yeah, so metaethics is a subfield of moral philosophy, and maybe the best way to think about it is by contrasting it with what most people, I believe, think of when they think of ethics. And the contrast I've got in mind is the study in which you try to discern what's right and wrong, or good or bad, or virtuous or vicious, and um, perhaps ultimately try to come up with a principle that explains everything, like the golden rule, for instance. So if I tell people that I teach moral philosophy, they immediately shoot me the latest ethical conundrum and ask me to try to figure it out because I'm a philosopher. And I usually fail at that. But uh, what what I'm doing in my research, at least, is not trying to figure out what's right and wrong, primarily, or what's good or bad, uh, rather than focus on the content of ethics. What metaethics does is focus on the status of moral judgments, moral claims, uh, and ask whether or not, for instance, moral claims express our beliefs or our emotions primarily, whether or not moral claims can be true or false, what sorts of things might make them true or false. Is it, for instance, God say so, or the communities say so, or no one's say so? Uh, and sort of zooming out from the substantive meat and potatoes work in ethics that tries to solve concrete ethical problems and asks what's going on when we're thinking about ethics in the first place. What's the deep nature of moral reality? Is there such a thing? Can and if so, how can it be known, if at all? And how's morality like or unlike mathematics or the law or etiquette? Um, these are the sorts of questions that meta-ethicists that keep meta-ethicists up at nights,
Yeah.
yours truly included.
Just to recap, we're not what meta ethics is kind of dealing with or trying to answer. They're not, I guess, like the normative questions, right? It's like, okay, like what should I be doing here in a given situation? It's more of just when I say, like racial injustice is wrong, or this is wrong, or that's wrong, injustice is wrong, whatever. What do we actually mean by that? Like when we're saying something, and
Mhm.
does it have any um, kind of truth aptness to it, right? So can it be true or false, or is it just kind of expressions, or I guess in some sense, like with are um, they are beliefs, but there's no actual property, no value property there. So in kind of a nihilistic way. And so if we want to move into now a little bit what realism is and kind of what your position is and
Sure.
as you define it, yeah.
Yeah, so one way to chart the whole territory of metaethics when it comes to views about what moral reality is, you have on the one side, I think you use this term, the nihilists, nihilism. That comes from the Latin nihil, which means nothing. You have nihilists who say there isn't any such thing as moral reality. We talk as if there is. We say such things as uh, racial injustice is immoral. We should seek to end racial injustice. But when we say such things, we can't be saying anything that's true because there is no moral reality that our claims might somehow match up to. That's one end of the spectrum. And then there's an intermediate part of the spectrum according to which there is such a thing as moral reality, but it's in some way constructed. Uh, maybe it's maybe what's right and wrong is in the eye of the beholder. And so each individual, this is called subjectivism, gets to be the final judge or final arbiter about what's right or wrong or good or bad. And then you've got more, then you can zoom out a bit and talk and say, endorse a kind of cultural relativism, according to which morality is real, but it's real in the same way that the law or etiquette is real. Namely, there's a real set of standards out there, but it's constructed by human beings, by and for human beings. And that's the way, and that's the way morality is, according to these cultural relativists. And you can zoom out yet farther and say, no, what morality is it's constructed by some ideal version of us, or perhaps by God. What's right and wrong is whatever God tells us, whatever God commands us, for instance, or whatever God loves or endorses, or something like that. Um, that's the intermediate part of the spectrum. And then there's moral realism at the other end from nihilism, at the opposite pole of the spectrum, which says that there is an objective moral reality. And what it is to be objective is to hold, to have the features it does independently of anyone's attitudes taken towards it. So on moral realism, which is the kind of view that I hold, to say, for instance, that we should stop racial injustice, which is something I believe is true, uh, is to say something like the following. Racial injustice as a practice has a certain moral feature. It's immoral. It's wrong. It's morally forbidden. And it has that feature not because I think it does, and not because we together, whoever we happen to be, think it does, or even ideal versions of us, or even because ideal versions of us, if we were smarter, more rational, think that it should be forbidden. No, it just is wrong. There's something, and in the view I hold, there's something in the very nature of this practice, racial injustice, that basically is wrong. It's by its nature, this kind of practice is wrong. And if we are sensitive enough to moral reality, we'll be able to see. In some respect, this might be metaphorical, not necessarily literally see. That depends. But we'll see, in some sense, that it is wrong. We'll be able to appreciate, in other words, the nature of a moral reality that's not of our own making. That's the realist view.
So for a quick question, I guess for clarification, so in your book, Moral Realism: A Defense, you kind of highlight that your position is a stance independent, and kind of what you're highlighting here. Um, so is this a difference between something like more of like a I don't know, like metaphysical realism? I don't know if that makes sense. So the way I look at it is that to some degree, it seems to be the case that right and wrong, and so let's take racial injustice. So if we were to remove all humans or even just sentient life from a planet, it would seem to be then like certain value properties wouldn't exist. But as a result of humans being here on this earth, there are and other sentient creatures, the value properties are then kind of emergent from that. Now, is that something of you that you would subscribe to, or is that accurate? Or yeah, what do you? I guess, and overall, kind of, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would distinguish two things. So I guess if I had to answer your question, I'd say no, I don't actually agree with the assumption that you just made. But I think that we can probably end up on the same page by introducing a distinction. One is between whether or not certain properties, that's just a philosopher fancy talk for a feature, certain features exist, versus whether or not they are, here's another fancy philosophical term, instantiated, whether or not they're realized, whether or not they're embodied in the world. And what I'd say is, according to all the realists I'm familiar with, what we can say is this: let's distinguish between moral principles on the one hand and concrete moral facts on the other. Where a moral principle is something like the golden rule or the principle of utility, which says always act so as to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And and what the realist is going to say is, with regard to principles, those principles are true, and they're not true. They don't become true only when human beings or other moral agents come on the scene. So, I mean, let's just imagine. I doubt this is the case, but let's just imagine that we humans are the only moral agents in the universe. Okay, then you, according to the picture as I understand it, that you drew, what we would have to say is this. Well, let's say 5 million years ago, before there were any human beings around, then there weren't any moral, there wasn't a moral reality. Moral reality emerged, to use your term. It's an emergent feature, where it's composed of emergent features. It emerged only when moral agents like human beings emerged. What I would say is, the more typical realist view says this, that we've got a bunch of moral principles out there that make reference to moral properties like wrongness or rightness, goodness or badness. And these principles obtain uh, eternally. It's wrong to perpetrate racial injustice, and that's true. That was true 10 million years ago. That was true a billion years ago. It just so happened that a billion years ago, let's assume there weren't any persons, there weren't any races back then, so there weren't any concrete moral facts to the effect that, oh, that action is unjust, that action is just. So the principles are true. We don't make them. If we don't make them true, then there doesn't seem to really be a point at which they would on this day they became true, and before that day they weren't. So if you can't make that kind of breakpoint, it seems that the principles are always true. Uh, but whether or not there are specific facts that answer to those principles, or to, as I put it earlier, instantiate or realize those principles, that's another matter. So let's take it from. I'll let you. Let's just take it from the flip side. Imagine now, there is racial injustice in this world, and let's once more assume that we are the only moral agents in the universe. I don't believe that assumption, but let's just assume it. Okay. Then in that case, suppose an asteroid hit the Earth tomorrow and it obliterated the Earth. What a realist would want to say is that 2 days from now, the day after the obliteration, there isn't any racial injustice any longer. There are no concrete moral facts to the effect that this action is unjust, or this law is unjust, because there aren't any laws anymore. There aren't any actions anymore. Everything's gone. Nevertheless, what the realist would say is 2 days from now, and 3 days from now, and actually forevermore, it's immoral to perpetrate racial injustice. It's just that and that's an objective truth. And then the question is, is there anyone instantiating or realizing the property of perpetrating racial injustice? In that
Okay.
case, the answer would be no.
So to see if I'm tracking this right, so I mean, let's take our moral language talk out of this and talk about something more natural, like law of gravity. So it's kind of like, even if no humans were around, and to some degree, the law of gravity locally would still be, in existence, or as real as anyone is able to either observe it or experience it. Is that something kind of loosely what we were talking about?
It's
And it would
sorry.
continue to happen even if humans cease to exist, or anyone cease to actually witness, such as like the law of gravity. Um, is that
It
something tracking?
in
Yeah.
that it's Yeah, it's a very close analogy. Yeah. So whether, before we had any language to speak of the law of gravity, before there were any human beings around to conceptualize gravity or the effects of gravity, the law of gravity was still in place. It was still a part of reality. Um, it may be, what some realists like myself say is that the laws of morality, whatever they are, and that's a matter for other ethicists, not the meta ethicists, but the other ethicists to try to figure out. But whatever it is that's the correct, principle of morality or principles of morality, they are like the law of gravity in that they hold that they are part of reality, regardless of whether there are people around to appreciate their existence or to give them names. The way in which there might be a difference is that some realists, myself included, think that the laws of morality have what's called a kind of modal force that's even stronger than those of the laws of physics. So we can imagine, for instance, physicists can easily imagine this, and so can the rest of us, that there are other laws. Just think of science fiction-y scenarios where the laws of physics that hold in our universe don't in fact hold. So we can imagine gravity, where conditions in which the law of gravity doesn't hold. But if you're an extreme kind of realist, as I am, that's not true when it comes to the moral laws. The moral laws, although we could imagine that whatever moral laws hold here don't hold elsewhere, it's that imagining doesn't actually answer to a real possibility. There's no possibility that there's no world where those laws don't hold. In fact,
So these are kind of like necessary truths, or something that's like I'm
yeah,
thinking of
that's right.
like a square triangle, right? So there's no possible world where you can have kind of like a square triangle. It's kind of like it's just a metaphysical necessity that in every possible world, uh, there's no you can't put the two together. Is that I don't know if I'm tracking on that.
Well, you can put so if your claim is that a square is non-identical to a triangle, to a single triangle, then that claim is a metaphysical necessity, and that's the sort of, as I put it, modality, the kind of necessary force
Mhm.
that I think moral laws have as well.
Okay, perfect. So, I kind of want to move into now. Yeah, why should we be more realist? I guess I don't know if that's the right question to ask. Or why be sympathetic to moral realism, or why think moral realism is true? There we go.
I'll take any one of those questions.
Yeah.
So that's a great question, and the I don't. I wish I had a 10-second answer to that question, but I don't. I can give you in largest. I'll give you two versions of the answer. One is quick and dirty, and the other is a little less quick and even dirtier. The quick and dirty answer is that there are what strike me as insuperable difficulties with non-realist views, and that's very quick. Sorry, and the flip side is there are lots of attractions to the realist view. That's very quick and it's far too summary, and I don't expect anyone to believe me just on the basis of that. But that's just an outline why I think that realism is attractive. It is able to here I'll drill down just a little bit. It's able to account for a great many of the data that we have about morality. And in work that I've been doing for the past few years with two collaborators, one is my colleague John Bankson, University of Wisconsin, and another is Terence Cuneo at the University of Vermont. What we've done is we are working on three books, one of which is just gone to press on philosophical methodology, and the other two are defenses of moral realism, extended defenses of the metaphysics and epistemology, among other things, of moral realism. In the methodology work that we're doing, what we have defended is the idea that fruitful philosophical inquiry should be data driven. It has to start with careful attention to the data. And what are data in philosophy? Well, on our view, they are claims that are neutral, uh, starting points for inquiry that constrain inquiry in the sense that if you ignore the data, then you're far likelier to be off track in your investigations. The data themselves are claims that inquirers considered collectively have really strong reason to believe. Um, Now, when it comes to the data about ethics, these claims include things like the following: that there are right and wrong answers to ethical questions, that we are fallible, that we sometimes have moral knowledge, that we sometimes make moral mistakes, that moral claims are belief like. They are sometimes true, they're apt for inference, they're uttered in the declarative mode. Um, these features and many others uh, constitute data. Now, you don't have to accept the data. The philosophers don't have to accept the data. But if they reject a given datum, they have to give really strong reason for doing so. And of course, if you ask someone on the opposite end of the metaethical spectrum, those folks I call nihilists, how much of these data do you accept? They'll say maybe one or two. And with regard to the other 20, nah, not on board with them. And that's totally legit for them to say such a thing. I mean, I think in the end they're not going to make their case that well, but that of course is a prejudice. It's not prejudicial. It's based on thinking about this for 20 years, but it is tendentious. It's not something, there are lots of smart people on the other end of the spectrum from me in meta ethics. But it's incumbent on them to say why it is that despite the appearances, uh, morality isn't really like what the data say it's like. Um, what the realist has to do, on the one hand, is easy and hard. Here's the easy thing. The easy thing is when it comes to somehow properly addressing or accommodating these data, the realist has a pretty easy time of it, better than any competing theory, I think, by a large margin. Uh, but then realism has a bunch of burdens it's got to account for as well. Like, for instance, you had mentioned before we went on air, you had said, "Well, I hope we get to talk about supervenience issues," which for listeners, sorry, who aren't familiar, supervenience is a relation between moral features and non-moral features, which is basically captured by this idea that if two situations are non-morally identical, they have to be morally identical. And that's almost everyone seems to accept. Almost everyone accepts that. This being philosophy, there are people who don't, because it's very hard to achieve unanimity in philosophy. But almost everyone believes this. And then the question is, why? Why does this hold? And realists notoriously have difficulty accounting for this. They owe an explanation of this. There are other data, like here's a datum. There's widespread disagreement about what's right and wrong, and some of which appears unresolvable. That's a datum too. That datum doesn't, realists don't have a ready account for that datum. Realists will have to supplement their view and come up and to try to come up with an adequate explanation of this, let's call the disagreement datum. As with supervenience, realism doesn't account for everything doesn't account for all the moral data, but it does account for a much broader swath of the data than any competing theory. That by itself does not make realism the best theory. Intertheoretic comparison in philosophy is a very vexed, tricky business. And in this work about methodology, Terrence John and I have a lot to say about how best to proceed when making intertheoretic comparisons between, for instance, realism and nihilism. But one desideratum for thinking that a theory is true in philosophy is its ability to handle the data in a pretty smooth way, and realism does that. Where it fails to do that, for instance, with regard to supervenience or with regard to accounting for moral disagreement, other theories do better. No question about that. I just think they do better in far fewer areas than realism does. That's the less quick and the much dirtier version of why I like realism.
So, kind of moving forward, I would like to put on the table. So let's comparing moral realism to as the theory and the kind of nihilism as a theory, and kind of in some degree comparing the two as a critique to realism. I think nihilists have kind of came out and I think said a couple of things. One, if there is such a value property out there, how do we interact with it, or is there really a property even there? And as part of just the overall like ontology or metaphysics, even and then epistemology, it appears to be more parsimonious and yeah, able to explain a little bit more about why, for example, like one can tell socio biological evolutionary story of why we have, moral outrage when certain things kind of come about. And that seems like it's not necessarily that uh, it's true or we believe these things. These are kind of primitive um, reactions that we have. And so as a result of that, it's kind of more parsimonious to stick there instead of saying like, well, there's this independent moral fact of the matter that's this value property that's supervening upon these non-moral situations. And so, yeah, what do you think about that? And as when we compare it between realism and nihilism, what
Yeah,
is like,
so I concede that nihilism is the more parsimonious theory. There are lots of different conceptions of parsimony. Let's just stick with one, according to which one theory is more parsimonious than another. If that first theory incorporates fewer or requires fewer types of entities in its ontology, and nihilism is definitely more parsimonious because what realism does is it says, okay, let's take the scientific worldview, let's accept everything that's there, and let's add something to it, moral properties. And the nihilist says, no, we don't have to add that. That's just an excrescence. That's superfluous because we don't need moral properties to explain anything that we see in the world. And if they're not needed for that, then they haven't earned their place in our ontology, in our theory of what exists. Um, so the nihilists, so what the nihilists need to do is they need to do a couple things, at least. One is to offer some kind of argument for thinking that what strikes so many people across cultures and across times as obvious is in fact false. And let's just take one example of, and that is matricide, killing your mother. And let's make it even, you know, easier. And as killing your mother because she didn't give you the money that you wanted. You know? Almost every, almost everyone through the ages has thought that that's true and obviously true at that. What the nihilist is going to say is that's not true. It's either false or at least it's untrue because the nihilist claim is that nothing's wrong, nothing's immoral. So even killing your mother because she didn't give you, spending extra spending money, that's not wrong. It's not that the nihilist is going to say, "Oh yeah, that's right." It's that wrong and right just have no application. That's the nihilist view. Well, if you've got that kind of view, then you are flying in the face of a lot that uh, most people through the ages have thought to be obviously correct. And so the nihilist owes us an account of how it is that we've fallen into this error. And there are various such accounts to be given, but the one that most nihilists like that I know of goes something like this: that if you think that there is such a thing as moral reality, you think that it has some kind of normative authority over us. That if something is wrong, then ipso facto we've got some reason not to do it. If something is our moral duty, then ipso facto we've got some reason to do it. And I don't understand. Nala says that's super weird. That's why this kind of normative force, as I put it, this reason giving, this intrinsic reason giving power, isn't something that we see other types of facts give us. The fact that something is red, the fact that something is square, that doesn't by itself give us any reason to do things. But all of a sudden we've got these things like, oh, if you killing your mother, that by itself, that it's wrong is or signifies a reason by itself not to perform that action. So there's something odd. something sui generis, as some people like to put it. There's something unique unto itself about moral properties. Now, there are two ways to go. One is to say, you know what? Actually, that commitment to normative force is not built into morality. Whether or not something's wrong is one question. Whether we have a reason to act in conformance to morality is another. That's not the view I hold, actually, but that is one way to escape this argument from the nihilist. The other way is harder, but it's the way that I prefer, which is to say, yeah, the commitment that the nihilist identifies, that of embodying normative moralities, embodying normative force, that commitment is a real one. And then now it's incumbent on the realist to say, and others to say how it is that morality acquires its normative force. And this is no trivial matter. I don't want to minimize the difficulty for the realist. That said, I think there are adequate answers to that question. Um, we'll see if you want to pursue those, then we can do. But just I want to move on quickly to the parsimony point, and that's in response to that, I just want to say the following: that of two theories, that one is more parsimonious than the other does not by itself give you any reason to believe it. That's my view. It's a minority view in philosophy, but it's a view that I think is defensible. In this methodology book that I've written with uh, John Banks and Terence Cuneo, we introduced the following example to make that point. Consider the solipsist position, which says that there's only one entity in the universe. That's you. Uh, that's a simpler view than the standard realist picture, according to which there's all of us, according to which appearances aren't vastly deceptive here. There are billions of trees out there. There are millions of houses out there. There are billions of people out there, and they're living they're roughly the kinds of things you thought they were. That's a much less parsimonious ontology than the solipsist ontology, which says there's just you and your thoughts, and your thoughts your thoughts represent all these, or purport to represent all these millions of people and things like that, but they're just the contents of your thoughts. Just like your dreams purport to be representational, but they don't match up to any reality. They're just a figment of your imagination. That's what all other people are. That's the solipsist view. But that the solipsist view is much more. I guess I should have said this out, at the beginning. The solipsist view is crazy. You shouldn't believe the solipsist view. You are not the only person in this universe. There are other people, including me, for instance, who's talking to you right now. So, and yet, if we are to adhere to this methodological canon, which says, of two views, if one's more parsimonious than the other, that's the one to believe. Then, while we would be led to believe nihilism over realism, we'd also be led to believe solipsism over an ordinary picture of what exists in the world. And that's not a good implication. So that's all to say, when it comes to parsimony, I agree the realist position is less parsimonious, but I don't think that should carry much weight by itself.
So yeah, in a way to give more realism, kind of a little bit more, I guess, um, I guess. So like when I'm thinking of, if someone is a nihilist about moral or value properties in general, also commit them to like epistemic, I don't know, nihilism, I guess, or epistemic anti-realist positions. And I think Terence Cuneo,
Mhm.
yeah, he has a book, The Normative Web, and I believe where you have these um, epistemic um, values that we use in the scientific method in the scientific method. And though these kind of value properties they're not identical, but they're just like moral properties. And so if we accept epistemic realism, or that there are things like that, then we would accept moral realism. Yeah, kind of. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm relaying his argument correctly, but yeah, what do you think about that? I know you're familiar with his work, so. Yeah.
So what Terence wants to do is in that book, The Normative Web, that excellent book from 2007, he offers, Jacob, what you sketched is a parity argument, Parity. It's not Parody. It's a parity argument where he tries to show that the moral and the epistemic realms are on a par with one another. They stand or fall together. And for those readers who are interested, Terence is the one who really put that argument on the map, and that book merits careful attention. Um, so, if you here's what I'd say: there are some nihilists, most of those who are writing these days, who are willing to consign epistemic reasons to the dustbin because and they feel compelled to do so because they accept this parity argument that epistemic and moral reasons stand or fall together. Since moral reasons are falling, epistemic reasons have to go with them. And if epistemic reasons have to go with them, what that means is that we can never correctly, accurately say that we have good epistemic reason to believe anything or to disbelieve anything. And that's a bitter pill to swallow, I think. And they realize that flies in the face of what most people believe, and so of course they, being the smart philosophers they are, have things to say in response to try to mitigate the stomach upset that you might experience by taking this view to heart. And then I just leave it to readers to see whether or not they can accept uh, that implication or not. I should say though that not I don't think that the nihilist position is in principle committed to this parity argument. What nihilists could do is say, look, we allow that there are such things as epistemic reasons. What they would say is this: I can give an analysis in a wholly naturalistic way of what an epistemic reason is. It's a consideration that raises the probability of the truth of a given proposition. And if you grasp a consideration like that, then we can speak innocently, if you'd like, of having epistemic reasons to believe that proposition. But that's all it is to have an epistemic reason. There's no irreducible normativity, nothing essentially normative about what it is to be an epistemic reason. It's just to be a probability increaser. And we can understand the notion of increasing probabilities without any normative language at all, any normative concepts or properties at all. What the moral realist is going to want to say is when it comes to moral reasons, there is an element of normativity there that just cannot be got rid of. And so, what the moral nihilist is going to want to say is, you're right, realist, about that. There's this element of normativity that cannot be got rid of when it comes to morality. And then they're either going to accept the parity argument and say, well, so too for epistemic reasons, and therefore we have to get rid of epistemic reasons too. Or they'll try to say, no, there's a relevant difference between the two, and we can keep our epistemic reasons while getting rid of the moral ones. It's complicated stuff. I think I'd send you to Terence's work and then to Jonas Olsson's work for a stellar example of a nihilist in action. His book on moral error theory tries to vindicate the nihilism about morality while still allowing us to keep our talk of epistemic reasons or epistemic justification in the way I just described.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting stuff. So let's continue moving on. Um, so assuming moral realism and assuming that there are value properties and principles, um, one thing I would like to touch upon is how do we access these things, right? Because they appear, if they're there, how do we know about them? And how do we kind of know that the principle is right?
That's another great question. And realists will divide on this question. Moral realism per se does not dictate an answer to your question. So what realism what realism is committed to is the idea of this objective moral reality. Some people, like myself, think that realism is further committed to this idea that at least part of that reality is accessible to us, that we can grasp it. But some people think that's an optional element to realism. I think a realism without the hope of some epistemic access to that moral reality is a kind of thin-blooded, watered-down realism that doesn't really answer to the motivations that push people to realism in the first place. But that's a taxonomical issue, and we can set that aside. For those realists, all of them, actually, that I know of, who want to defend the claim that we can gain access to this moral reality, there are a bunch of different ways to answer your question. In this terrific book, I would say the best book written on the subject yet, which is by Sarah McGrath, a philosopher at Princeton, called Moral Knowledge. She's not defending realism there, but what she is defending is this thesis. I don't remember what she calls it. Maybe she calls it the parity thesis. Maybe she doesn't have a name for it. Maybe she calls it something else. What she says is that we can gain moral knowledge in every way that we can gain non-moral knowledge. We can gain it, for instance, through testimony. We can be taught it by those who know or understand things themselves. Where we are ignorant, we can learn sometimes at our mother's knee, for instance, but even as adults, there's a lot for us to learn by means of the wisdom of others. And so we can gain moral knowledge by means of testimony. But that's not a fully satisfying answer because, of course, that person must herself or themselves have discovered, come to the knowledge or understanding in some way, and it can't go all the way back by a chain of testimony. So we need some other answer. Some people, I'm not a big fan of this myself, but some people like the idea of moral perception. They think that we can literally use our perception, our senses, our perceptual faculties, so as to be able, for instance, to literally see the wrongness of striking a child gratuitously, just because you're angry. And you slap a child across her face, and that certainly evokes an emotion in most of us, and we're able to form the judgment and willing to form the judgment that that's wrong, that's immoral to do. Some people claim that what we're doing is we are seeing the wrongness there. Among other things, we're of course seeing a hand blur through the air, and we're seeing a red mark on the child's face, or seeing tears well up in the child's eyes, and then hearing the scream. But we're also, among those things, in addition to those things, we're able to see the wrongness there. I'm not persuaded that this kind of view is correct, but I'm not persuaded that it's not yet. I just haven't thought enough about it. On its behalf, its proponents just say this: there are a lot of things that we see that are complex things. They're not just, just to talk about what we see visually. What we see is not just patches of color and shapes, but we can say such things as we see an airplane, or we see that a person is angry. And when we see, just take the latter, we see that a person is angry, that's a quite complex state of affairs that we're perceiving, right? But it does to many people make sense to say that we are literally seeing the person's anger. But anger is not something like the color red or the shape of being triangular. It's a very complex phenomenon. If it does make sense to say that we can, if it does make sense that we can see such things as anger, which is a complex property, a complex phenomenon, it may likewise make sense to say that we can see the wrongness of actions, even though the wrongness is a phenomenon that's much more complex than some things being triangular or red.
So what do you think
But
about so I guess two questions. One, what do you think about kind of Michael Huemer's like ethical intuitionism, and you kind of using intuitions to kind of guide some of our epistemology there, as some principles or just some actions or qualities are just kind of self-evident, but they're kind of guided through the by our intuitions. So that's one question. Another question is, so take a situation such as um, torturing a baby for fun. So kind of in this scenario, you have the torturing, with the suffering, the child suffering, and the pleasure that's being taken from the suffering. Could it be the case as like, I guess, from a moral perception, like giving those actions or given the whole phenomenon of experience right there, does that qualify as a, let's say, wrong making property? And when you get all of those combined, that's the property we're seeing, which is the property of wrongness. So yeah, what do you think about those two?
Yes, I'll take the latter first. With regard to the case about perception, that is exactly how a case of moral perception, if there are any such, would have to go. What you're perceiving is the um, the base the base features, the features that ground the wrongness. There's no question that we can see those things. Then the question is whether, in addition to seeing the actions that constitute the torture, are we also seeing the wrongness itself? And for those who endorse the possibility of the existence of moral perceptions, they answer yes. We're seeing the complete package. We're not just seeing those, the striking or, whatever the form of torture takes. We're not just seeing that, but we're actually able to see the wrongness as part of the whole package there. But everyone who endorses the idea that some actions are wrong or right will endorse the idea that they are wrong or right in virtue of their exemplifying other features, like being an unmerited slap, or being being a gratuitously vicious jibe, or whatever it happens to be. Then, with regard to your first question about intuitionism, of the sort that Michael Huemer defends, for instance, and that I've defended in an intuitionist view in my book from almost 20 years ago. I still think that intuitions are uh, the first place to look when you're trying to construct a theory of how it is that we come to gain an awareness of of the moral features of the world. I'm not a fan any longer of talking about self-evident propositions. But I think of intuitions in the way that humor is thinking about them, and the way that my colleague John Banks, who's written extensively on the nature of intuitions, thinks about them. Namely, they're not themselves beliefs, but they are, I guess you could put them, they're sort of being strikings. You are struck in a certain way when you contemplate something, and when you see something, when you contemplate something, something just strikes you. When you contemplate a particular proposition, which says, for instance, that torturing children is wrong, then you think about that, you reflect on that, and so long as you adequately understand the content of the proposition, then if it strikes you that, oh yeah, that's clearly wrong. It doesn't have to be clear, but clarity certainly helps. Then you're justified in forming a belief on the basis of being struck by being impressed in that way, being struck in that way, having an intuition, as we'd say. And that can justify your beliefs. And in the absence of uh, problems, things called defeaters for your belief, those beliefs can serve as knowledge. You can know that torture is wrong on the basis of your intuition. People do have different intuitions, and people can form intuitions under poor conditions. And to the extent that they do, those intuitions are far less credible. But there's no reason I think there's no reason to believe that all of our intuitions are formed in unreliable or otherwise problematic conditions. And there are some reasons to think that they are sometimes formed in excellent conditions. And when they are, those intuitions uh, serve as good bases for moral knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. Perfect. So, kind of in closing a little bit, if you want to just kind of recap your position and a little bit about why moral realism in your belief currently is the more plausible position to hold.
Well, moral realism is this view that morality is objective in a really robust way. And to if you ask why it's plausible, um, two quick reasons. One is that the other views that deny realism are not, at least on my weighing out, very plausible. To think that there is, if you're a nihilist, nothing wrong, whatever, with killing people for sport, for instance, is too incredible to believe, really. If you are someone who says, no, there is a reality, but we get to make it up in some way or other, I'd say is that no matter who we are, we answer to a reality not of our own making. We are all fallible in various ways. We're imperfect in various ways. Why base a morality that's meant to be authoritative on the imperfections of those who are making it up? Just take a look at the law to realize there are imperfections in the law. It doesn't matter what society or jurisdiction you're in, and that's because the people who are making it up are fallible. Uh, the same thing to me holds when it comes to morality. That pushes me to think that morality is objective in a really strong way. Why? In addition, when you think about the data, uh, things that inquirers consider collectively have really good reason to believe, realism does an excellent job of handling almost all the data. And in those few places where it doesn't, I think there are plausible supplementary cases to add to realism that make it more committal, but also make it, on the whole, a quite rich and attractive package.
All right, very nice. There's one last question I do want to ask you is that because your moral realism, it's been out for quite some time now. Um, you mentioned this a little bit earlier that you don't really weigh on kind of self-evident principles anymore, to some degree. But in the last, 20 or so years, how has your view changed? And yeah, kind of where are you current? Well, yeah, how has your view changed? There's anything that you don't subscribe to anymore, or things that are, yeah, there things have just changed for you.
Yeah, there are a bunch of things I don't subscribe to, but I don't. Rather than bore your readers with a long list of my past failures that I know of, not to mention all those that I don't know of, what I'll say is this: I'll just stick to the epistemology part. In this book, Moral Realism, that came out almost 20 years ago, one thing I did was defend a reliabilist element to in my moral epistemology, and I don't think that's a plausible element. I would just jettison that. The the epistemology that I'm working on now, I'm doing so in conjunction with John and Terence, and some of that we actually have a book that's in progress that's largely devoted to epistemological issues, and it's an extended defense of the role of intuition, not only in epistemology actually, but in action theory. And I guess what I would do is I would emphasize now much more than I did back then how fruitful attention to intuition can be. And I'm also I think better equipped to answer various skeptical challenges to intuition because they're not few and far between. A lot of people find appeals to moral intuitions very suspicious, and I think that they're right to do so in a limited way because our intuitions are not self-ratifying. A number of them are formed under bad conditions, but as I said earlier, I think that many of them are formed under good conditions, and we are justified in relying on them to do a lot of philosophical work for us.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah. Is there a place where people can find you, where maybe you have a blog, or where your other works that you might be on, or yeah.
Yeah, I have no social media presence, whatever. I do have a website that I put together. Maybe my daughter put it together about 15 years ago. It still has a picture of me from 2000 and whatever, from the early 2000s. I don't have, I have more gray hair than I did as if you've never met me or anything, you might be led to expect a younger Russ Shafer-Landau than you'd actually come across on the sidewalk. But yeah, like I said, no, I don't have a social media presence. But if you are in Madison, you can find me there. And I do have a sort of archaic website where there's some rudimentary stuff about me.
Perfect. And I will leave your books in the description for the readers to buy and check out.
Thanks a lot.
All right. And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time.